Hi everyone, welcome back to Poetology. I decided to review all the books I read in 2021 and pick some favorites. 2021 has not been my best reading year in terms of the number of books I've read, because I think I read just under 50 titles. And just to give you an idea of how much I can read, in 2018 I read 100 titles. I say titles because some of them are books, some of them are poetry pamphlets, some of them might be poetry magazines or other magazines that I've read. So whatever text I read in full, I often list on that particular record. In 2018, I was doing a PhD, so I read a lot for my research. I was also teaching at university, and I was getting into poetry, and that was a separate thing from my reading, teaching, and research. So I read a lot of extra books that year. It was a very productive year of reading for me. Since I finished the PhD, the last 2 years have been less prolific in terms of reading. I think it's partly just letting go of that pressure to read with strict deadlines, combined with lockdowns and just the general effect of coronavirus. I am much more hooked to my mobile phone and find it much harder to concentrate on tasks for a long period of time. So that's something I am working on, but I think it affected my reading. My health also wasn't quite as good, but also, after my PhD, I treated myself to a Nintendo Switch, and I'm sure many reading hours went into Zelda Breath of the Wild, Animal Crossing, and a few other games that I really enjoyed. No regrets there. It's just what it is. My quick reviews will be split into 3 sections. There will be poetry, fiction, and non-fiction, because I like to read across genres, and I think everyone can benefit from reading many different types of books. So let's start with poetry. The first one here is John McCullough's Reckless Paper Birds. I really enjoy collections that have a clear theme that runs throughout the collection, and this is one of them. I loved that it takes place in Brighton and that the landscape of Brighton is so vivid, and of course it's also gay, and there's a lot to say about the way in which John McCullough looks at everyday things, everyday landscapes, everyday objects, everyday events. There is a kind of magic in these simple occurrences, and of course a lot of bird imagery, a lot of birds, plus some of the poems are quite camp. I think this is my favorite collection of the year. I'm saying this because the next 2 are actually pamphlets. I really love pamphlets, partly for the reason I just mentioned, the fact that I like clear themes running through a book, but also because there's such a joy to read. You can just sit down and read an entire pamphlet in one go and get immersed into the work and not have to split it into several readings. It's also much easier for me to pick up a pamphlet on the shelf and read it again than it is for me to do the same with a full collection. So, here we go. This is Serge Neptune's These Queer Merboys. And I've mentioned it before. I've also interviewed Serge. I'll put a card above if you want to have a look at that interview. This is also queer, as the title suggests, and it revolves around water themes and the Little Merman, and a sort of mythologization of the Little Merman as a figure, as someone who suffers out of their element and is trying to reach out to other people, but sustains a lot of wounds and difficulties as he does so. There is also a thread of violence. Everything is a little bit rough. It's not a Disney mermaid. It's a much rougher version of it. And that's also something I liked. It looks at suffering without flinching, and I really enjoyed this. The third one is also someone I've interviewed for this channel. It is Kostya Tsolakis' Ephebos, and again, as the other 2, it has a very clear theme that I enjoyed. It is also gay. This year was all about gay poetry, and it talks about coming out as gay, and also has a very clear Athenian/Greek landscape running throughout. You can see those landscapes. You can also see Catholicism and the poet moving away from Greece and living in England. For example, there is a correspondence with the speaker's mother. It looks like this. It is titled Fragments of Emails from My Mother in 2011, the year I came out to my parents, the peak of the Greek financial crisis. And so all these things come together in the poem. It's actually both poignant and hilarious. I also have two honorable mentions. One is for Will Harris's incredible Rendang. The style in which Will Harris writes is pretty amazing because it feels like a collage of so many various types of discourse and occasionally images too. And sometimes the tone is very conversational, and at other times it takes off in unexpected ways and is incredibly poetic. This collection has so much texture and color. I also recommend it. And finally, this is a slightly older book. It came out in 2017. It's Autopsy by Donte Collins. And Donte Collins is a Black American writer who is also queer, and they write about grief and losing their mother in a very gripping way. And I particularly enjoyed some poems. So some of these poems really stand out. 5 Stages of Grief, for example, is a poem that has really stayed with me since reading it, and I've read it a number of times now. Some of those poems really hit me hard, and it's a great collection. I've just selected 5 men. That's not always how I read. It just happens to be my favorite books this year. I'll have to make an effort to put more variety, maybe even read more straights, you know? Will Harris is an exception. But I realize that the 4 others are queer. Let's move to fiction. So my favorite novel this year, by far, was Louise Erdrich, The Night Watchman. I love Louise Erdrich, so this is no surprise. I've been reading all of her work because she was one of the authors that I studied for my PhD. So I've read pretty much everything she's written. And yet, I think that this novel really stands out as a big achievement. It won the Pulitzer Prize as well, so I'm not the only person who thought this book was a great achievement. It talks about a tribal community fighting against the US government's so-called Emancipation Bill. So it's set in the 1950s in North Dakota, and it follows one character in particular, the Night Watchman, but also all the other characters and their interactions and how tightly woven they are and some of their histories. And it talks about so many different things, such as sex trafficking, alcoholism, and tribal self-determination, how people need to come together, and how difficult it is to mobilize a community for a common goal. This is an absolutely gripping novel, and I think you should read it. A slightly older one again, I read A Tale for the Time Being. I've mentioned it before in another video. I read it when I was in the United States, so that also is something I love when I read something during a trip or during a particular time of my life. I remember both as being interwoven in some way. I didn't expect to like it that much. It's a book I had lying around for ages and didn't pick up for years for some reason. It's already a second-hand copy. When I finally picked it up, I loved it. I love the way it combines Buddhism with contemporary life in the United States and how it put 2 women's life in parallel with one another and explores both of these. The narrator lives on an island in the Pacific Northwest, quite removed from the rest of the continent, and there is a whole thread about tides and how tides can bring objects and waste from Japan all the way to the Pacific Northwest. And these tides actually follow Gaias as well. So there are Gaias that just suck things up and then spiral them outwards and bring them to other shores. And this was fascinating. I really enjoyed how we followed someone in Japan and someone in the United States, and how their fates were somehow interlaced, even though it was a tenuous thread at first. It's also very innovative in the way in which it thinks about fiction. What is fiction? What is it doing? It looks almost like a memoir sometimes. Is it memoir? Is it real? What is real? What is not real? I loved how it explored these questions. This will not go down as my favorite novel of all times or anything like that, but I thought it deserved a special mention. It's Detransition Baby by Torrey Peters. And this is not my favorite type of book. I think it's probably classified as romance or maybe a social novel, but I would say romance. I mean, it's pink for a start. But it explored the desire of a trans woman to have a baby and how she goes about trying to secure a situation for that child in a very unusual way by reconnecting with her ex, who has detransitioned and is now in a new relationship with a cis straight woman. And how the three of them navigate that. It's very sassy, it's very clever, it's very contemporary, and it represents trans issues in a way that hasn't quite been done before, to the best of my knowledge. I read a lot of nonfiction in 2021, so the next 3, 4, 5 books are nonfiction. The first is The Collected Schizophrenias by Esme, Weijun, Wang, and this came out in 2019. It is a collection of personal essays. They say autobiography. I would have said personal memoir. It discusses the author's experience of schizophrenia and how she navigated both the experiences, the diagnosis, what happens later, her life now. And she does it in a very intelligent way, going into a different subject for each essay and exploring it in some depth while weaving it into her experience at the time. And this book, in many ways, helps rehabilitate schizophrenia as something that can be talked about, but also people who have schizophrenia as people who have a voice and who should be listened to. I love her as a writer. I am also very intrigued by the community she's creating online. I think I really like Esme Weijun Wang and the work she's doing. Now, I have also mentioned this book in a previous video, and this is Clairvoyant of the Small, The Life of Robert Walser by Susan Bernofsky. It's a brand new book. It was published in 2021, and I was very intrigued by it, not only because I saw it on Eileen Miles's Instagram, and sometimes that is all it takes, but also because Robert Walser is a Swiss writer, a Swiss-German writer, who was born in the same town as me. And I wanted to immerse myself into this turn-of-the-century narrative of a writer who is trying and often struggling and sometimes cuts a rather pathetic figure, and how he makes his life between Switzerland and Germany, where his brother Karl Walser meets much more success as a painter, later internalized in a mental health institution, and that's where he spent his last years. I also like his writing. He was a poet. He wrote short-form drama, dramalettes. He also wrote a few novels, and I wanted to explore places that I am familiar with a different perspective. Another thing that is worth saying is that when I say he comes from the same town as I do, we still speak different languages. I'm Swiss French, whereas Robert Walser was Swiss German, so we don't exactly share the same culture, even though we share the same landscapes. But this book really took me, if not somewhere else, to a different time. And sometimes I really like this Walser sometimes he sorely disappointed me. The writing of this biography is excellent and I was hooked. Another huge favourite was We Both Loved in Pleasure. These are the selected diaries of Lou Sullivan from 1961 to 1991, edited by Ellis Martin and Zach Osma. This is also a fairly new book. It came out in 2019. Lou Sullivan, if you don't know it, was a trans man who was maybe, if not the first, at least the first vocal and well-known gay trans man. And as such, he is quite important in transgender history. And this writing is sexy, this writing is funny, it's entertaining, and it's very touching. You should also know that Lou Sullivan unfortunately contracted HIV, and so it also traces the last years of his life and how he dealt with that, at the time, deadly virus. I will definitely be rereading this again. I wanted to give two more honorable mentions for nonfiction. One is Paul Preciado's Je suis un monstre qui vous parle, which is published in English as Can the Monster Speak? And it is a report to an academy of psychoanalysts. Basically, Paul Preciado gave an address to this room full of French psychoanalysts and made quite a sensation by being himself. Paul Preciado is a philosopher and he's also a non-binary trans man who explores questions of gender and sexuality in the tradition of Foucault and Derrida, and he is quite a sensation. Have a look at what he does. I first came across him through Testo Junkie, which was a huge thing for me when I read it. And finally, Shon Faye's The Transgender Issue is a book that came out last year, 2021, and it's something that needs to be read now. I think it really takes an overview of the state of transgender politics and transgender rights, especially in the UK. It's extremely timely, very necessary. If you haven't looked at it yet, please go and find a way of reading it so that you can be aware of what's going on for trans people in the UK and how to make healthcare more accessible and how to ensure that human rights are distributed for everyone. It's an argument for justice, not just for trans people, but for everyone. And it really shows the ways in which transgender rights are connected to other types of human rights that also need to be fiercely defended. At this point the camera cut, but I had finished reviewing my favorite books of 2021. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what your favorites were, and I will see you again very soon. Bye!